How did Hitler view capitalism then?
Hitler's views on capitalism were confused. So on the one hand, he thought it was kind of like a kind of a Jewish selfish enterprise that was kind of like unworthy of kind of like German culture. On the other hand, the competition mechanism, which underwrites free markets and capitalism, was one that had analogies to the way he understood how societies work. So by a constant process of fighting, confrontation, natural selection, the strongest will emerge. So there's kind of like an admiration for the successful big businessmen because they had come through this kind of process of competition and natural selection, unless they were Jewish, in which case they'd achieved this by kind of like nefarious, kind of like underhand methods. So although kind of the Nazis often claimed to be socialists, it was really kind of like the socialism of racial equality rather than a socialism that we would recognise. And some historians, try to make the argument that the Nazis really were socialists, but they're wrong.
Dr. Christopher Dillon is senior lecturer in modern German history at King's College London. He has authored many books and articles on the history of the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany. And today, we're going to be tackling an incredibly fascinating, if not an often discussed subject, and that's the inner workings of Nazi economy. Professor Dillon, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be invited.
Feels kind of odd to put these two words together, doesn't it? Nazi and economy, because it's not something histories of this period usually focus on. Now, I do remember that back in school, in high school, while going over World War II history, we did mention the planned economy of the Soviet Union and the industrial might of the United States. But when it came to Hitler's regime, we kind of focused on the constant political and genocidal horror show, which is understandable, but just doesn't provide like a comprehensive picture of the story of the Third Reich. I mean, also in the popular understanding that's usually out there, people will throw in the fact that the Nazis built the Autobahn and that they invented the Volkswagen Beetle car, which is supposed to imply that Hitler was onto something economically. But I do suspect things were a little bit more complicated than that.
Anyway, there'll be a few myths to bust in this session.
Perfect. Anyway, since the Nazis didn't come to power just out of the blue, I think it would be nice to inspect what role did the economy play in that rise at the beginning. So maybe let's start here. We all know about the great crash of 1929, often touted as one of the major reasons Hitler was able to exploit the weakened state of the Weimar Republic. But in what shape was Germany's economy just before this catastrophic tumble?
Yeah, I mean, historians kind of differ in their assessments, but generally the economy is in pretty good shape, and certainly much better than the popular myth would suggest. So there's kind of like an economic apocalypse in 1923 when the French and the Belgians occupied the Ruhr, and the German currency tips into a hyperinflation that leads to kind of like devastating kind of levels of prices, like billions of marks for an egg, this kind of thing. But
is that the famous picture of the pyramid building?
That's right. Yeah. It's kind of like children kind of like building kind of like walls out of banknotes, and I guess these scenes can seem quite amusing to us, but at the time for Germans, it's deeply traumatic. But somehow the economy bounces back very rapidly from this kind of apocalypse, and between 1924 and 1929, it kind of GDP grows at a decent clip of about kind of 4% per year, which is, very good by interwar standards. There's a kind of a surge in industrial output of about 8% a year. And this is kind of based on a big cult of scale that rests on kind of an admiration for America. So you mentioned America in your intro, and this is a big kind of like reference point for the Weimar Republic. So there's a cult of Henry Ford, for example, the automobile tycoon in the US. His autobiography sells hundreds of thousands of units in Germany. Productivity soars during this period, and wages also go up. So things look pretty good. In contrast to our sort of idea of Weimar as being somehow doomed, if you look from 1928, it looks to have a really kind of like a bright future. There's a set of industries that kind of emerge that become very important in Nazi Germany. So IG Farben, it's a giant chemicals conglomerate, is formed in 1925. United Steelworks, a big kind of vertical combine for heavy industry, 26. The car makers, Daimler and Benz, also merge in 1926 to create a new kind of like world-leading kind of outfit that will become important again after 33. Even in banking, there's a set of mergers in 1929. And all this seems at the time to create a set of German Weimar economic units that can compete with America's giant corporations. And there's also a time of great consumerism. So we think of the Roaring Twenties, and these are really very roaring in Germany, partly because after losing all their savings in the hyperinflation, Germans don't want to save, they want to spend. And so you get this kind of quite sort of dizzy consumerism, modern department stores, cinemas, nightclubs, spectator sports take off, fashions, start to rival Paris. You have a whole new visibility for young women. So one of the kind of most famous aspects of the Weimar Republic is the sort of young new woman. And this is kind
Like
of
a German version of a flapper.
That's right, yeah. So they've got kind of like short, kind of like booby cop hair. They smoke, they drink in public. They're basically carving out a new kind of life stage between leaving school and getting married. And they really sort of become sort of internationally famous, kind of like as kind of like emblems of kind of like where Germany is developing. And the key to all this, just to set up what happens next, is Germany's return to the gold standard. And this was kind of like a 19th century international monetary system, which basically pegged how much everyone's currency was worth to particular measures of gold. And what it meant was that countries couldn't just print lots of money, because what they could print was tied to how much gold was in their vaults. So it kept kind of like currencies very stable, unless you happened to discover, kind of like a haul of gold in the Rhineland, which didn't happen. And under this, lots and lots of money flows in to the Weimar Republic. So Wall Street in particular is attracted by returns which are far greater than those available back in the already booming US. So something around kind of $3 billion flows in to Germany in the late 1920s. And this is more than twice the amount, just to illustrate it, that later comes to West Germany under the Marshall Plan. So it all kind of flows in from Wall Street and underpins massive investment throughout the economy. So there's lots of new roads, railways, there's new subway systems in cities, there's mass building. So Weimar's famous for its housing estates, really large, cutting-edge units. And ones in Berlin are now kind of UNESCO heritage sites. They're so kind of important and cutting edge. And this is why it seemed to be going so well. This is one of the choking things for us, because we know what came afterwards. It really did seem to be that Germany had finally sorted itself out and had kind of like a bright and glittering future. There's a very generous welfare state. So in 1927, a law is passed in Germany which provides unemployment assistance without means testing, which is an extraordinary step by kind of like, interwar standards. And all this money also helps Germany to pay its reparations under the Dawes Plan. Germany makes all of its payments. So things seem to be looking up. You've got Germany's rehabilitating the international stage. Its economy is humming very nicely. There's kind of social progress. But there is, of course, a vulnerability, which is that if all this foreign money dries up, for example, from Wall Street, then what happens next? So you've got, in some ways, a mortgage democracy that is dependent on being able to constantly refinance its debt and on the kindness of strangers, essentially. And this is the scheme that kind of like that starts to implode with the Great Depression.
That's really not what I was expecting to hear. I thought the economy of Weimar, the Weimar Republic, was kind of like this wounded animal the entire time, and then the great crash is just the coup de grace, at the end. But that's not what you're telling me. But I wanted to ask you, you described it as a new age of consumerism, this period in the 20s. Does that mean that also a new kind of urban middle class of people is growing in Germany?
Yeah, there's a large, people have larger disposable incomes, and Germany has a very kind of like rich tradition of kind of cultural provision. And more people can afford to go to the cinema, can afford to go to see plays, can afford to go and see artwork and eat out. It's just, there's a new vitality, I think, to particularly urban life. I mean, if you're unlucky enough to be, the daughter of a farmer in East Prussia, then your life is by no means changed by these social innovations, and you'll spend your days still paddling around in pig poop. But if you're lucky enough to be in the city, then you get to explore these new these new life stages in a way that that your mothers, let alone your grandparents, wouldn't even have recognised. So there is a new urban strata, particularly for kind of like white collar employees.
Okay, here's the big one. So what did the Great Depression that followed the crash that we mentioned at the beginning do to the Weimar Republic's stability and also to people's livelihoods?
Yeah, but this is the big one. Yeah. So it changes everything. So I focus first on the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. Now we have like a cartoon image of the Reichstag from, various TV series and films with a sweaty den of extremists shouting past each other. But that's by no means the case before 1930. In 1930, kind of like stung by the Great Depression, the electorate returns the Nazi Party and the Communist Party to the Reichstag as the second and third largest kind of groupings, respectively, and everything breaks down. So before 1930, all kinds of legislation is passed with pretty large, healthy majorities, including this Unemployment Assistance Act I just mentioned, but also kind of like quite controversial laws around kind of like morality, gender, sexuality. And the Reichstag even comes quite close to repealing the law against male homosexuality in 1929, which would have been, very kind of like pioneering step in international context. But then comes the Great Depression, and voters going to just start to turn to the extremes. So the key fact I'd like our viewers to remember is that in 1928, the Nazi Party gets 2.6% of the national vote. 2.6. This is minute stuff. So the idea that you've got a republic that's simply waiting for a charismatic savior is in no sense borne out by this stat. And then just a couple of years later, in 1930, they get 20%, out of nowhere. One of the most stunning surges in German electoral history. Suddenly, the Nazis become the second biggest party. At this point, the Reichstag seizes up because the Nazis and the communists have no interest in kind of passing laws or kind of like making a meaningful difference. They just want the parliament to be a propaganda platform. And this is the point at which politics moves from the parliament, where it's been kind of all the way through to 1930, onto the streets with paramilitary violence, and also to the sort of the circle of people around the elderly Paul von Hindenburg, who is a president. And he's equipped with emergency powers. If the Reichstag breaks down, Hindenburg decides what happens. And now the Reichstag's broken down, and this kind of is very much kind of like what happens.
But at that point, he's what, like 155 years old?
Yeah, he's certainly, he must be 83 or something by then. So,
okay.
Older than Joe Biden, towards the end of his presidency. And I think in many ways, a deal less there than Biden was. Hindenburg is a guy who fought in the Franco-Prussian War, going like in 1870. So, what he's got to offer a modern, sophisticated, liberal democracy kind of like is unclear at the time and has been ever since. Now, in terms of people's lives, the Great Depression, curiously, initially, it's not a major change. So the Wall Street crash in 1929 is terrible for German bankers. But it doesn't make a huge difference to the lives of most kind of Germans. And in fact, there's some Schadenfreude. So there's a very large kind of like German community, German-American community in the US. And quite a lot of German families are quite entertained by the sight of these kind of loudly prosperous German Americans being cut down to size. And they see it in some ways as a rebuke for the Versailles Treaty. But from this point onwards, once the loans from Wall Street, they're not cancelled, they're just not renewed, which means that companies can't invest, they start to lay people off, and then this turns into really quite a desperate spiral in Germany. So Germany is kind of like, outside the US, the most impacted by the Depression. So its GDP falls by 42%. I just have been a comparison for, our British listeners, is that in Britain, GDP falls by 16%. But the Great Depression has a huge footprint, even today, in kind of like in British political culture. George Orwell, for example, makes his name kind of like, writing about the miseries. In Germany, it's almost 3 times worse. And it really does kind of impact kind of every kind of aspect of life. So nearly 6 million Germans are recorded as being unemployed in 1932. But if we compare how many were employed compared to how many then are employed later, it's probably around 9.5 million Germans are unemployed. And it's huge in some sectors.
And the population is what? Around 60 million?
About kind of 60 odd million. So it's a really very large number. And shipbuilding, kind of like 2/3 of kind of people are unemployed. Because Germany is traditionally an export economy. So once exports kind of like dry up, and there's a unhelpful and very topical set of tariffs that are introduced, kind of like by the US, any kind of worker that's involved in an export industry, is going to be kind of waiting outside a locked factory gate, to get kind of any hope of work. The Weimar welfare system cannot cope. So this unemployment law was kind of designed for maybe a maximum of 800,000 people. When you've got 9.5 million people, there's nothing there. So people are dependent really on charity, begging, foraging. It's a real kind of like, it really shows kind of like just how quickly an apparently modern, sophisticated welfare economy can crack down. So 500,000 people are homeless. There's stories of children in kind of school playgrounds playing signing on games, where they pretend to go to the unemployment office to get unemployment support. Suicide rate soars, and women kind of bear the brunt. So women, in some ways, the winners of the Republic they bear the brunt during the Great Depression, because they're the ones that are in charge of household budgets, trying to get hold of kind of daily food, trying to keep things ticking over. So it really feels like an endless and hopeless downward spiral. And it's unsurprising that Germans start to clutch at straws in political sense and to think that it's worth kind of like spinning the wheel. And this is where you get the Nazi vote. As I say, nothing in 1928, less than 3%, 20% by 1930, kind of like once the Depression starts to kick in. And it just goes upwards all the way until late 1932, the Nazi vote in local elections, national elections, just tracks the kind of unemployment, tracks the decline of the economy. And this changes in late 1932. The Nazi vote drops by about 4%, which devastating to the sort of sense of inevitability of the movement. But this is because the economy is improving a bit, and so it starts to go down. And then
there's a direct correlation with
absolutely, absolutely. Kind of like, I think historians sometimes get kind of bored of the assertion that the Nazi vote kind of reflected economic circumstances, but the fact that it goes down when the economy starts to improve slightly, is pretty kind of like pretty compelling.
But why the Nazis in particular? There must have been other people offering easy solutions at that time, other parties.
Yeah, so you've got Nazis and communists are the two, and these both have an enormous advantage that they've never been in government. So, it's always easy to hector from the sidelines. The communists have been very briefly in government in a German state for a couple of weeks. Nazis, in the state of Thuringia, they've kind of had like a post of Minister of Culture, but they're really not at all tarred with the kind of track record of the Weimar Republic. And so they benefit from the anti-incumbency kind of like protest vote. Their hands are clean. They're promising radical solutions. No one's quite sure which, as I'm sure we'll come on to. But if you're unemployed, you voted communist. If you were worried about becoming unemployed, you voted Nazi. And this kind of like, this is why they benefit. So it's the idea of sort of the horizon of expectation is so gloomy that people think, well, I'm going to roll. At least they seem to have some energy.
I wanted to ask you, since people often say that the rise of the Nazi Party is a direct consequence of this dramatic economic downturn of 29, but you kind of answered already. So the answer is yes, probably, right?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. It doesn't entirely explain why it's the Nazis that benefit, and this relates to German political culture, to the Versailles Treaty. There's all kinds of reasons that are extreme, kind of like chauvinistic nationalism with kind of like weird socialist undertones, kind of like is the beneficiary of the anti-incumbency vote, but without the Great Depression, Hitler is nothing. There's quite an amusing kind of like excerpt. I think it's the British ambassador writes his memoirs in 1929. And when he mentions the Munich Putsch, he feels obliged to put in a footnote to explain to readers who the hell Hitler was. And this is just, a year before he breaks through. So this kind of really illustrates that, Hitler is saved by the slump.
By the way, I recently went to an English bookstore here in Japan where I live. And while browsing the Second World War section, I spotted a pretty bizarre looking yellow book. And lo and behold, it turns out to be the English edition of Mein Kampf.
Oof,
it was kind of unsettling to see it just laying there on the bookshelf like it was a gardening manual or something.
That's right, yeah.
Because I used to live in Berlin for 10 years. And of course, you would never see it there in any bookstore.
Yeah, there's been a scholarly version's been kind of like been brought out that's got all kinds of like annotations to kind of like to make sure people aren't kind of like drawn in by anything that Hitler says. But there's so many kind of annotations have to be added to it. It's quite kind of like hard to kind of like to absorb it as a reader.
Even though people who read it usually say it makes for an extremely boring and tedious reading.
Yeah, it's utterly tedious. Yeah, it's just kind of there's a jumble of kind of like it's typical autodidact. So Hitler kind of not any great particular education, just kind of like spewing forth things he's heard, things people have told him. There's no coherence to it, really.
Okay. So yeah, I imagine that Hitler, who was pretty much like a high school dropout or something, probably didn't have super sophisticated views on the economy. But I wonder what, if anything, did he write about the subject in his dreadful little book?
Yeah, I mean, there's not many specifics. So it presents the economy as being like a racial phenomenon.
What does that mean?
Exactly. It's just good that for Hitler, the master category of history is race, and therefore the economy is just in some ways like a epiphenomenal kind of secondary expression of racial relations. So all that's good about the economy comes from so-called Aryans, and all that's bad is a result of kind of like a Jewish or Slavic influence. So the Jewish so-called parasite is in control of international finance, has department stores that put honest, rosy-faced German tailors out of business. The Versailles Treaty is kind of a form of economic rape of Germany. And there's some admiration for the US, especially in his unpublished second book, which comes out in 1928. And Hitler kind of shared in the general kind of Weimar German kind of like admiration just for the scale of what the US is achieving in terms of industry and Taylorism and Fordism. But after 1945, very, very, very many Germans claim they voted Nazi because of their economic policies. Because obviously after 45, this was probably the safest thing to like divulge as being the motivation for voting for them. But the harsh truth is the Nazis didn't really have an economic policy. Even now, historians like me struggle to work out, what they claimed they were going to do and what they did do. So the idea that Germans at the time had some kind of like clear impression seems kind of like entirely dubious. With the century of hindsight, we don't know. So how would a German voting in 1932 really have had a sense kind of like what the Nazis' economic intentions were? Basically, it's economic populism they offer. So
they're just saying, we're going to make it better. Just, take it.
We're going to make Germany great again.
Yes.
We're going to, we're going to kind of like free you from the sinister influence of socialist and Jewish elites. We're going to free Germany from the bondage of international finance. And you'll soon see that, once we've got the Jews out of the way, Germany's going to flourish like never before. But there's no real kind of like sense of kind of like of economic theory or of reflection. What there's a few kind of reflationary plans. So these are economic packages designed to create work. So the state would create money and would use this money to give to firms to build bridges, whatever. This would then create employment opportunities for the unemployed Germans who would then have money in their pockets to spend. And this would kind of like help to kind of like get the economy ticking over again. So the Nazis bring out a couple of these in 1932. The first one is quite big. It's 10 billion Reichsmarks. But this causes a negative reaction amongst kind of the business community and amongst the middle class who fear hyperinflation coming back. if you start printing money again, this is going to create hyperinflation. So they scale it back down to 3 billion. And after 1933, what the Nazis do is pretty much they take schemes that have already been developed by the late Weimar governments of Franz von Papen and General von Schleicher, just rebadge them as being kind of like Nazi initiatives and kind of take the credit for whatever kind of difference they make.
Speaking of the business community, in 1932, the Nazi Party was famously facing financial ruin. But then just a year later, the Nazis moved from being totally broke to actually being in control of the German government. And what happened in the meantime was that apparently some of Germany's biggest industrialists decided to bail them out. Why did the capitalist class bet on this, mildly put, wildly unpredictable, loony, autocratic regime?
Yeah, I mean, it's a left-wing myth, generally, that the big business launched the Nazis. So, for Marxists, it's pretty obvious that fascism is simply the mailed fist of kind of like of big capital. But we now know that most Nazi revenue comes from its members. So they pay membership dues from events. So people will kind of pay to go and hear, Hitler or Goebbels speak, or selling the Nazi newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter. This is where most of the money comes from. There are some early Nazi donors, so Fritz Thyssen, who in fact owned the United Steelworks concern that I mentioned earlier. He's an early kind of backer, and he likes the nationalistic kind of foreign policy. But generally, big business spreads its bets across all the middle class parties rather than kind of like them picking out the Nazis. But there is a very infamous meeting, or should be more infamous, that happens on the 20th of February 1933 between the Nazis and 24 German businessmen. So they all kind of turn up in Hermann Göring's palatial flat in Berlin. Hjalmar Schacht is there, the Nazi central banker. And Hitler makes a speech saying that Weimar had shown that democracy and capitalism were just incompatible, because democracy gives a vote to workers who can then use this to return left-wing parties who take away bits of profits and funnel them to their clients. And so Goering says, we can stop all this. We're going to have one more election, and it's going to be the last election for 10, maybe for 100 years. And if we win this election, we're going to sweep aside the German labour movement. You guys can make profits. And this is crucial due to the fact, as you say, the Nazi Party is broke. So between 1930 and 32, there's an endless sequence of national elections, state elections, municipal elections. There's presidential elections the Nazis contest. These are all very expensive. And so the Nazi Party is broke. So it's about 12 million kind of Reichsmarks in debt. So big business agree there's big contribution towards the last election that's going to be held in March 1933, which in turn funds Goebbels' kind of massive propaganda drive and delivers just about enough votes for the Nazis and their nationalist allies to have a majority in the Reichstag and to start dismantling the Weimar state. And the motivation of big business isn't that they particularly like the cut of Hitler's jib, though some did. They just want to crush the labour movement and get bigger profits. And from the regime's point of view, bigger profits for business means they've got more money to invest in research and development, and particularly in armaments business. So big business has got more money, it can then kind of create more modern plant and more manufacturing techniques, which will help Germany to rearm. And this does happen on an unprecedented scale.
How did Hitler view capitalism then?
Hitler's views on capitalism were confused. So on the one hand, he thought it was kind of like a kind of a Jewish selfish enterprise that was kind of like unworthy of kind of like German culture. On the other hand, the competition mechanism, which underwrites free markets and capitalism, was one that had analogies to the way he understood how societies work. So by a constant process of fighting, confrontation, natural selection, the strongest will emerge. So there's kind of like an admiration for the successful big businessmen because they had come through this kind of process of competition and natural selection, unless they were Jewish, in which case they'd achieved this by kind of like nefarious, kind of like underhand methods. So although kind of the Nazis often claimed to be socialists, it was really kind of like the socialism of racial equality rather than a socialism that we would recognise. And some historians, tried to make the argument that the Nazis really were socialists, but they're wrong. There's nothing there really of any kind of socialist character at all.
Once they swing into power, what kind of economic policies do the Nazis implement? You talked about them a little bit already, but especially given the fact that they're already kind of looking forward to waging war.
Yeah, well, I argue you mean the first key policy is that the Nazis destroy the German labour movement. So this is the trade unions, the Socialist Party.
So much for socialism.
Absolutely, yeah. So the German labour movement is the biggest in the world outside the Soviet Union. It's really powerful. And the combined vote for left-wing parties, so the communists and the communists and the Social Democrats, in November 1932, the last free election of Weimar, is much larger than the vote for the Nazis. So it's very clear that, if they want to win the hearts and minds of German workers, they're going to have to remove these kind of like these rival suitors. So there's a mass wave of violence starting in February 1933 after the Reichstag fire. Communists are locked up in camps, and increasingly so are trade unionists and socialists. And all of the assets of the German trade union movement, this is everything from, that the German trade unions had banks, building societies, bowling clubs, newspapers, huge amounts of property are all seized and put to the disposal of the German Labour Front, which is the Nazi sham trade union under the control of Robert Lai. So with the left out of the way in concentration camps, in prisons, intimidated, big business can start paying less of the national pie to workers and keep more for itself. This extra slice of the pie, the Nazis hope, will then be funneled into rearmament. So this is on the violent level of 1933. Then you've got these various kind of like pump priming kind of initiatives that happen in early 33. First myth to bust here: the Nazis did not invent the Autobahn. The first Autobahn was opened by Konrad Adenauer, later kind of like West German president, in the summer of 1932. The Nazis merely kind of like emulated this to some extent. Most of the work creation schemes that they use in 33, I say they're inherited from Weimar, and they're rebadged as being some genius Nazi initiative. So it's house building, repairs on roads, building new bridges, reclaiming marshes, all of which is kind of gobbled up by the cameras as an example of kind of like a singular Nazi zeal and elan. There's a very, very large amount of spin involved. The other kind of like initiative was the role of Hjalmar Schacht, who was initially in Weimar, a fairly kind of like left-leaning democratic character, but radicalizes in response to the Versailles Treaty and becomes kind of like a Hitler whisperer for the German elite. Schacht is described at the Nuremberg trials as being the financial genius of Nazi Germany, which probably pleased him somewhat. Certainly pleased him more than the various accusations people made quite rightly about him being a Hitler enabler. And he has a new ministry, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, that meddles extensively in all elements of German trade. So it's Schacht that decides whether you get a few dollars to import something from the US. You don't get to decide yourself. So it's a real micromanaged kind of economy. And he wants to make sure that all foreign currency goes to sort of war-related industries and not to consumer sectors. And does this on a really very, very minute scale. So by 1934, Schacht is down to his last few dollars and pounds. He's literally rummaging behind the sofa trying to find a few dollars to import from the US. And this then leads to the other kind of well-known Nazi policy of autarky. So if you can't import consumer stuff from overseas because you don't have the foreign currency for it, you've got to make your own. You cut yourself off from international trade. And this means that kind of like Germans kind of like have to use their own kind of like domestic radios, for example, which are rubbish compared to ones they could have got from the US. And the big dilemma that this is all trying to solve is whether you prioritize guns or butter in the economy? So on the one hand, do you rearm heedlessly and not worry about the consumer sector, or do you want to keep consumers happy and then kind of like rearm alongside that? This is the great balance that's struck, well, I mean, almost, for the next 12 years, really. And Hitler sometimes blinks. So Hitler sometimes worries about the consumer sector not being enough butter and orders Schacht to allocate some of this foreign currency to import fat, for example. It does this on a couple of occasions in 35 and 36 because there's widespread perception that the regime's not really as popular as it claims to be by then. So if you look at the Gestapo underground reports from 35, 36, people are kind of a bit sick of the Nazis and they're sick of empty shelves and kind of like rising prices. So the Nazis then start to allow some imports of food just to kind of to offset this. But the balance between guns and butter runs like a red thread through the Nazi economy, kind of all the way through to the end. Schacht also has quite a clever wheeze for rearming, and that he creates a new form of credit, which are called MIFO bills, which these are basically IOUs issued by the state, which are backed up by Germany's kind of like platinum industrial corporations, that allow the regime to rearm off the books. So they don't have to borrow money from the bond markets or borrow money internationally. They instead create this credit and then keep it kind of like semi-hidden inside the rearmament economy. This is because of the Versailles Treaty, kind of forbids Germany to rearm. So by 1938, about 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of these MIFO bills has been used to provide credit and liquidity to the armament sector. And it's not been inflationary at all because people have kept hold of the credit notes because they're quite an attractive thing for firms to hold on to. By 38, it doesn't really matter. Everyone knows the Nazis are rearming, so there's no need for secrecy anymore. So this is a wheeze that's kind of like that is pretty successful. And the other kind of policy is the 4-year plan, which is launched in 1936, which may remind you kind of Stalin's 5-year plans you mentioned at the start that you kind of studied at school. This is under Hermann Goering, proper Nazi of the old school, which wants to make the economy match fit for war within 4 years. So kind of like really kind of like putting aside the butter and going, really going all in on the guns. And the rationale was that the various problems of kind of like of matching up guns and butter over the previous years had shown Nazis needed to expand and get their own resources and not have to depend on kind of like outside people for their iron ore or for their oil. And therefore it's time to start to look towards the Soviet Union's kind of like oil fields or those of Romania rather than trying to kind of like either have it produced domestically via IG Farben, quite an expensive and inefficient process, or trying to import it from elsewhere. So the 4-year plan is about we need to have war soon to get these resources. We're running to the end of what we can achieve, kind of with with this kind of micromanaged economy.
You said that people voted for the Nazis based on the economy, but you also said that Nazis quickly turned to the kind of politics of guns instead of butter. So I imagine this was not good for most of the people's living standards. So are people responding to this in the 30s then?
There's many Germans kind of like were quite proud of the fact that there was kind of like, this reassertion of German kind of sort of social militarism. The Nazis bring back a social militarism, so a belief that it's fine, to believe in your country, and it's fine to, it's fine to start to rearm and to try and restore Germany's place on the international stage as a great power. But what they're
so kind of ideology takes over.
Exactly. Yeah.
Press
so, I mean,
economic concerns.
The Nazis were very popular, largely because they were promising to restore German honour on the international stage, and especially kind of like once there's a few victories after 1936, so the Rhineland is remilitarised. People kind of are more on board. However, people are people, and they don't like empty shelves. They don't like rising prices, and so there's a degree of simmering discontent that they can't have it both ways. They can't have the restoration of German military capacity and nicely full bursting shells with the finest quality imports, from Denmark or whatever. So there there's an inconsistency to how Germans respond, but that's human nature.
However, these big infrastructure projects, okay, they didn't do the autobahn, but other than that, they are kind of lowering unemployment, aren't they?
I mean, they do make a difference. So, I mean, the Autobahn, for example, only has a few thousand workers, and there's very low levels of car ownership in Germany. So compared to like the US, hardly anyone has a car. I mean, a good way of illustrating that is that in early Nazi era regulations for the road, you only had to drive on the right if there happened to be a car coming the other way. That's how little traffic there was around. So the idea that the Autobahn per se kind of revolutionise anything, kind of like is for the birds. They're mostly like sort of about fascist prestige and the latent military potential. Now, when it comes to the other projects, this building and this land reclamation, historians differ. So on the one hand, you've got Keynesians. So these are kind of like people that believe that, a state should be kind of fiscally proactive and should kind of like create jobs, should roll out worker schemes. And they tend to believe that the Nazis did kind of have success by creating jobs. So with this multiplier effect I mentioned, that people are employed, they spend money, and then this kind of like then feeds through to the commercial sector. And Keynes at the time said the Nazis kind of vindicated him, that they've shown that kind of like trying to get out of the trap by being kind of proactive had worked. And also Keynes believed that Germany kind of leaves the gold standard effectively in kind of like in 1933. This also kind of like helped. On the Hayekian side, so these are the more kind of hardcore free marketeers, they say no, that the schemes are much too small to have made a meaningful difference. So we're talking, kind of like, a few billion Reichsmarks, and this is not enough to have brought around the very clear recovery that the Nazis manage. And instead, the Nazis benefit from being very, very lucky. So they come to power when the economy's already turned a corner. They inherit these work creation schemes from the last Weimar governments. They can then badge as being their own. And the Nazis are also kind of extremely lucky in demographic terms. So one of the problems of the late Weimar Republic was that lots of young people are coming onto the work market in the late 20s, early 30s, who were born just before the First World War, which is kind of like a kind of boom years for the population. And the early 30s, you've got the cohorts from the war years coming on to the job market. And this is much smaller because soldiers have been away during the First World War. They've been much lower kind of like fertility rate. And so there could have been several more million people who needed a job had it not been from this lower kind of like both birth cohorts during the war. So the Nazis get very, very lucky here as well. On balance, probably their schemes did make a meaningful difference. So there's about 1 million people employed in them by the sort of summer of 1934. And employment is wiped out by 1936. But historians and economists still argue over whether the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, was good or bad for the economy, or whether Barack Obama's stimulus program in 2009 was good or bad. I mean, the Obama stimulus program was 4% of US GDP, a vast sum, much, much larger than anything a Weimar government could even dream of. And, economists still argue over whether it made any difference or not. So we'll never know for sure, but certainly in terms of the vibe, I think the vibe of having these work creation schemes, having them fanned by propaganda, having 1 million people kind of like employed in them clearly, does make a difference, but it's not necessarily, kind of like all down to the Nazis' brilliance. And also, I've got to break something to you here. The Nazis weren't very honest with their stats. So there were a lot of
a big shock. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to break it, but there's all kinds of massaging of the stats, and people who kind of like worked only in the summer are suddenly branded as being kind of like full-time workers. There's also a scheme that's used to encourage women to withdraw from the workforce. So newly married couples get a loan from the state, and for every child they have, they can pay off a bit less of it. And the idea here is that kind of you'll boost fertility rates, but also you'll keep women off the labour market and therefore off the job stats. there's all kinds of, yes, there's all kind of like dodgy counting that kind of flatters the stats. But on balance, yes, they did make a difference, but this may be partly down just to get the energy and vibe as much as to the actual content of the programs.
What were some of the biggest economic sectors that people were employed in? Like, what was a typical job in Nazi Germany?
They were pretty similar to kind of like they've been to a large part of the German workforce is still in agriculture. So it's a much more agricultural kind of like economy than, for example, Britain was, which had pretty much imported all of its food. So, a very large agricultural sector. You've got heavy industry. So, the Ruhr in particular is still kind of like huge numbers of lots of coal mining, so steel output. You've got, a growing kind of services sector. So kind of like, legal services, accounting, all the modern kind of phenomena. You've got a lot of small traders still. It's a very kind of mixed, kind of like of economy. But towards the end of the 1930s, you've got more and more people working in armaments industries. So, for example, by then, amongst the biggest corporations in Germany, you've got kind of Junkers, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, so the big kind of like aircraft manufacturers are real kind of become major players. So there's kind of like a reindustrialization of the workforce, especially in kind of like in heavy industry. But also, Germany follows the same path throughout the 20th century as other modern economies, that it moves slightly away from agriculture and more into like a services kind of like modern economy. And the Nazis don't make much difference here. There's a limit to what even the most determined and supposedly revolutionary of regimes can achieve, and they can't prevent women from forming an ever greater part of the labour force too. But there's definitely a stronger emphasis on rearmament, obviously by the late 1930s.
You mentioned the services industry. Did people from other countries ever go on a holiday to Nazi Germany? That sounds really wrong from today's standpoint.
Yeah, I think we look at Nazi Germany, from the perspective of kind of like of the Second World War.
That's like going on a holiday to like North Korea right now.
Well,
probably. Even worse, probably. But there are some tourists in North Korea.
There are not very many, I think. But we look at the Nazis through the prism of kind of Auschwitz and of the Second World War, whereas before 1939, it was a fascist kind of economy. Like Mussolini was quite widely admired. Fascism seemed to be the future in many ways. So kind of people come over, they're very interested in what's going on. And a lot of British right-wing newspapers are very much into the Nazis. The Daily Mail kind of infamously is a big cheerleader for fascism. So there's lots of tourism that happens. The Nazis are kind of pretty happy to have tourists because they create foreign currency. And they often send back pretty positive reports. The Olympics, for example, kind of like a massive kind of like amount of tourism is created. It's generally seen as, being a propaganda kind of like boon for the Nazi regime. So some of our best accounts, essentially, of what life is like in Nazi Germany come from foreign travellers, because Germans themselves, weren't free to write down at the time, exactly what was going on. So there's a strong flow, school exchange programs. It's all kind of rumbles on. I think only really in 1938 when you have the pogrom against Germany's Jews, that really how far the Nazis have moved from even the most kind of latitudinous understanding of kind of civilized conduct really becomes very clear, and the drumbeats of war kind of like do chill tourism.
Yeah, I'm originally from the Balkans, so when you said there's like a school exchange program to Nazi Berlin, that's kind of sent shivers down my spine.
Yeah.
Also kind of amusing. I wanted to ask, how much wealth did the state loot from its exiled and imprisoned, obviously later killed Jewish population? And was that like a boom for the economy, or what did that do?
No. So this is another myth that we can dispel. So there's an idea that that somehow taking Jewish wealth allowed the Nazi regime to buy off the German people, or somehow kind of like help the process of rearmament. But this is not the case, simply because the population of Jews in Germany is so small. So it's in 1933 it's about 0.75%, so less than 1% of the population is Jewish. And they simply didn't have enough wealth in order to enrich the other 99% or to allow the state to undertake ambitious rearmament programs, or certainly not outside of the anti-Semitic imagination, which imagined that Jews held this kind of like, this extraordinary amount of wealth. So there's around 100,000 Jewish businesses in Germany, most of them just small outfits. And these are going to gradually kind of like expropriated by the state or by other Germans in the 30s. But in terms of GDP, moving a Jewish business from its Jewish owner to a so-called Aryan owner makes no difference whatsoever. It's just it's an accounting transaction. So the idea that somehow giving a Jewish business to an SA man had made any difference to GDP or to the rearmament program is it's just completely illogical. There's also a good deal of pragmatism. So in summer of 1933, Hitler personally approves a credit line to a Jewish-owned department store in Berlin, Tietz, because he's concerned about if it goes bust, the unemployment stats will suddenly look worse. So there's a degree, kind of like of finessing. In terms of how in 1938, 80% of these 100,000 Jewish businesses are still in the hands of their original owners. This then changes over the course of the year. And there's a real kind of like intensive program of harassment before 1939 to force Jews to emigrate. So it's important to remember that the so-called final solution until 1941 is emigration. There's no kind of like plan to set up, gas chambers at this stage. And the economy is used as a vice to try and force Jews who hadn't yet immigrated to do so. So they're pressured to sell up and to move. So after the 1938 pogrom, on Hitler's personal order, 30,000 German Jews are locked up in concentration camps in order to terrorize them into emigrating. And they're only released if they promise to do so and promise to turn over their businesses. When Jews sold their businesses, they would have to do so way below the market rate, often kind of 20 or 30% of the cover value, and also to pay a so-called flight tax to the state. All of which, nets money, but the population is so small, it doesn't net enough money to really to be much more than a blip on the overall kind of GDP graph, despite, the sickening morality, but just in terms of the pure economics. And there's also a 1 billion Reichsmark fine is imposed on Germany's Jews for supposedly provoking the 1938 November pogrom, because the German ambassador in Paris was shot by a stateless Jew. And so the Nazi regime claimed that the German people have risen up in understandable outrage at this, and that the Jews should pay a fine. And also Jews that had insurance contracts on their businesses that they wanted to claim on for the damage that had been done during the pogrom, the proceeds instead are pocketed by the state, and Jews had to pay it themselves. So it does net money for the state. It does enrich kind of like juiced-in kind of like Germans, kind of SA men, benefit from this process, but it doesn't really, in terms of the overall macroeconomics, it's a rounding error. The sums are too small.
Okay, once the war starts in 1939, how does the direction of Nazi economy change?
That's a good question, because by 1939, the limits of a peacetime economy have already become kind of like very clear. So the raw materials Germany has or can get hold of are exhausted. There's not enough material to build more tanks. Even things like, army barracks can't be built because there's not enough kind of concrete around to do it. There's labour shortages, partly because so many Germans have been sort of called up and are doing military service, but also because the economy is overheating. It's trying to do too much, and there's not enough kind of labour around to carry out all the roles. The German central bank is basically printing freely. It's printing like a drunken sailor. It's like back in the days of the hyperinflation, because Hitler has sacked the entire board of the central bank to say there should be no more kind of like restrictions on the amount of credit the Nazis can use to rearm. And then once the soldiers depart to Poland and then to France, the economy is stretched even more. The workforce is even more thinly spread. So really kind of like by this point, there had to be kind of like a change of tack. And this is where some historians kind of have put forward the idea of blitzkrieg, a term that you'll be familiar with. And this is the idea that what happens in 1939 is the Nazis switch to a war strategy which involves quickly rolling over lots of opponents and basically kind of like grabbing all of their resources, and therefore kind of like feeding the economy, kind of like keeping it going in an ad hoc way. And then this links to the idea of guns versus butter, that they're still trying to, according to the blitzkrieg theory, to keep this balance. And the idea is if you can mobilize just in a short, sharp burst, this will then reduce the amount that butter is constrained for consumers. If you kind of like, you can really have an efficient, brief mobilization, this will then spare the consumer privation. And so the Nazis are haunted by the First World War, when there was kind of like a severe kind of like demoralization on the home front. And so some historians argue that there's a continuity in terms of what the Nazis do across 1939, in which they're trying to balance the consumer sector and the military sector, guns versus butter, which continues. This research now shows is not the case, and that basically blitzkrieg is entirely a myth. It's a myth in the economic sense because the Nazis are trying to get as many rearmaments as they possibly can right from 1939 onwards. And it's a myth in the military sense because the Wehrmacht does what any army tries to do, which is to win a war, to win a campaign quickly. And it's only kind of like, on the military side, it's kind of like British and French generals who claim the Nazis come up with some diabolical new military strategy, blitzkrieg. And on the economic side, it's Albert Speer. He's the Nazi that takes over the war economy in 1942 to made it much more efficient and not worrying so much about butter anymore. But again, this is with kind of research by particularly Adam Tooze, US historian, has shown that in fact that the idea there was any kind of like change in 1942 is another myth. And Nazis were basically trying to get as many arms as they could right from the start. And the fanatical pace of pre-war rearmament continues all the way across 1939. So it's far less of a kind of like a chronological marker than you might think. So the message is that blitzkrieg is a myth in every sense.
The Nazis had all of these political prisoners already, and then on top of that, they're starting to acquire all of these vast territories during the war. What role did forced labor play in their wartime economy?
Yeah, forced labor plays an enormous role in the wartime economy. So estimates suggest that Nazis used around 13.5 million people as kind of as foreign laborers from I think 27 countries in the course of the war. 1.5 million of these were kind of volunteers. Often kind of they come from Germany's fascist cousin Italy to work in the economy, but often volunteer should be understood in a very kind of like loose sense, that people are kind of like violently recruited to work for the Nazi regime. Initially, it's fairly slow. So by late 1940, you've got around 2.7 million foreigners working in the economy, including 1.2 million French and British POWs. So they've been captured during the fall of France, especially in the summer of 1940. And half of them are in farming and the other half are in industry. And the regime doesn't particularly make an effort to kind of like to do much more at this stage. The big turning point in the entire war is the setback for the Wehrmacht outside Moscow in December 1941. And at this point, the Nazis stop capturing so many Soviet POWs who can be used for forced labor. And there's a kind of a drive to recruit from all the way across Nazi-occupied Europe. So in 1942, you start to get French factory workers are kidnapped by the Gestapo and kind of sent back to work in Germany. And this certainly is what kicks off the French resistance. Kind of like this is what really spurs it. It wasn't necessarily the idealistic enterprise that French historians used to claim. So in 1944, you've got 8 million foreign workers in Germany. This is around a quarter of the workforce. 3 million are from the Soviet Union. And they're everywhere. So they're in camps, they're in kind of barracks, they're in hostels, they're in schools, they're in tents. And almost every German company is using unfree forced labour of some kind. And it's very, very visible all the way across German society. So, after 1945, many Germans said, well, I never came across a forced labour or a concentration camp in, I didn't know. This is extraordinarily improbable, unless you really are in a very kind of like far-flung area of Germany. These forced labourers are provisioned according to the Nazis' racial hierarchy. So the best fed are Germans, followed by West Europeans and Italians, followed by Central Europeans, and then towards the bottom of the ladder, you've got Slavs and Soviet citizens, and then Jews at the very bottom. So it's a quite elaborate kind of like hierarchy or taxonomy of ration allocation. And this is mirrored in productivity. So it turns out that Soviet prisoners produce far less per hour than did a French or a German prisoner. This is not because of the Nazis' claim the Soviets are kind of like lazy or backwards or uneducated. It's because they're not fed to the same degree. There's a very clear correlation between provision and productivity. And then the concentration camps too. So these were set up in 1933, but there's only kind of like 6 or so by the outbreak of the war. During the war, more camps are set up, and they all have kind of satellite camps, what are called Außenlager, which are then set up around various kind of like work sites or sent to companies. And there's around 600 of these Außenlager by 1943, all of which are kind of like carrying out work for the war effort or to keep the economy ticking over. The prisoners are very poorly treated. Sometimes they're building V1 or V2 rockets, which are these self-propelled rockets that are launched from German launching sites in France, kind of like against Britain. And in total, around 1.6 million concentration camp inmates are deployed in the war economy, and only kind of 475,000 of them survived the war. So there's a really kind of very, very high mortality rate. And they're very, very visible kind of like, throughout Germany. So I'd say this would be an unmissable kind of like phenomenon for your average German citizen.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that, we know that concentration camps were mainly like killing factories. But there's this famous scene in Schindler's List. Obviously, it's not a documentary where that poor man is making door hinges or something. So it's like maybe they were actually making stuff in concentration camps as well.
They were, yeah. I mean, even from 1933 in Dachau, which I wrote my first book on, you have prisoners who kind of like are being put to work, kind of like, reclaiming land, building wood, doing things in kind of like in camp workshops. It's important to separate between extermination camps and concentration camps. So extermination camps are ones that are set up kind of in Poland purely for the business of murdering Europe's Jews. Concentration camps have a longer kind of like pedigree in Nazi Germany. And there are some that have gas chambers, such as Majdanek or Auschwitz-Birkenau, but they're very much structured around a daily routine of kind of like of work. So the best memoir is Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. So he worked in Monowitz, which is a Auschwitz branch run by IG Farben. And so there is this emphasis on trying to get some productivity. Now, it doesn't work. Monowitz produces nothing that it's intended to, but there are attempts to get prisoner kind of labour to produce something for the economy.
All right, this is something I've always wondered. Since Germany was at war with literally most of the planet at that point, who was it left trading with? How did that work? Or did they actually manage to become completely self-sustainable during the war?
Well, the starting point here is that it's almost impossible to disaggregate a German economy from the European economy during the Second World War because so much is occupied by the Germans. So it's very much intertwined. So between 1939 and 1941, for example, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is an agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that they're going to be good friends for the foreseeable future. And under the framework of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, oil and grain and metals are delivered to Germany from the Soviet Union. So there's a kind of a big trade artery here. And in fact, after the Nazis break the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1941 and invade the Soviet Union, they actually wound up getting far less oil and grain than they had done beforehand. So it was economically counterproductive. After 1941, the Nazis control such a large slice of Europe that really kind of trade is not a big issue. And Hitler kind of like rejoices in 1941 that occupied Europe is the most blockade-proof place in the world, because the Nazis are haunted by the memory of the First World War, when the British blockade really had caused severe privation on the home front, really had kind of like created all kinds of discontent and privation. It's not a problem. And if you look at what the Nazis control in 1942, they have 290 million people are occupied by the Nazi regime. It's got a GDP bigger than the British Empire or of the USA. There's a diverse industrial base, so North Italy, France, the Ruhr, like the Central European breadbasket of Ukraine. It starts to look like a missed opportunity for the Nazi regime to win the war. And some historians, like Richard Overy, for example, makes the case that if you'd asked somebody in 1942 who didn't have hindsight, who's going to win the war, you'd think, well, it's going to be the Nazis. They've got this extraordinary economic resource that's integrated, that's quite sophisticated. You've got manufacturing in the West. You've got ample labour and resources in the East. All you do is reconcile these, and it's going to be a formidable economic unit. So it's all there. And Hitler is also able to feed the German people because the Nazis want to starve Eastern Europe. This is very much, part of the longer range plan. So the idea of Lebensraum, so living space for Germany, involved what was called depopulating Eastern Europe and then replacing it with kind of German soldiers and German peasants and and Germanizing it. So there's a particularly horrific plan from the SS called the Generalplan Ost, General Plan East, which foresees in Eastern Europe by starvation and forced expulsion, eliminating 85% of the Polish population, 2/3 of Ukrainians, 3/4 of Belarusians, so perhaps 45 million people in total are to starve in order that the food can, first of all, feed Germans and Western Europe, and then also in the longer term create this living space for the population. So the German citizens suffer much less until the end in the Second World War in terms of food than they had in the First World War. And this is all kind of part of the big plan.
What about when the war starts turning and also like bombs are flying on German cities?
The First World War, as I say, there have been really severe problems with morale, with productivity, even with with performance at the soldiers at the front, just from shortages. So from 1915, you see food riots, you see assaults on bureaucrats, you see town halls in provincial Germany being stormed by hungry and angry women. There's lots of strikes. There's a black market, and eventually there's a revolution in November 1918, which is very much fueled by the fact people are hungry and pissed off with the Kaiser's regime, which has failed to deal with food shortages. This doesn't happen at all in the Second World War, but this is mainly because the regime is much more ruthless than had been the Kaiser's regime. So there's very clearly declining morale from 1943. So you've got aerial bombing especially. So the US Air Force by night, the British Air Force by day. The Eastern Front starts to look like a losing cause after Stalingrad and the Kursk battle. Fall of Mussolini also is not a good omen for the prospects of European fascism. So there is clearly a downturn in morale, and this is aggravated by the shortage of consumer goods. People are eating okay, but the consumer sector is is definitely squeezed. But in 1943, Heinrich Himmler of the SS is appointed Minister of the Interior, and he's basically charged with preventing what happened in 1918 from possibly happening in Germany. So there's ruthless policing and sentencing, the Gestapo. There's no space in Germany for organised protests. I think people sometimes imagine that Germans could have protested against the Holocaust, but there's no kind of like political or space just for doing this kind of thing. And by the end of the war, you've got party activists, stringing up so-called defeatists from lampposts, So it's a different kind of like political regime entirely to the First World War. And whilst there was privation, probably Germans suffer more after 1945 from kind of like shortages than they did until the early months of 45.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, once the tides of war turn, excuse me, against Germany again, and living standards disintegrate, and it gets worse and worse towards 1945, does that begin to cause any uprisings within the Third Reich? But you pretty much answered already.
No, there's no capacity for it. And to some extent, Germans are still kind of like a positive about Hitler personally. He still has kind of like a resonance. There's a lot of social kind of like inhibitions, and there's a huge fear of kind of what the Red Army is going to do when it comes in. This helps to keep people in line, as well as the domestic kind of forms of terror as well, and propaganda.
Well, that fear ends up being quite justified, right? When the Red Army reaches these German cities, they behave, euphemism would be like really poorly. There's lots of sexual assaults. There's lots of killings and stuff, reprisals.
Absolutely sick.
And I've read somewhere recently that part of this rage was that due to the fact that when Soviet soldiers saw what kind of living standards Germans were enjoying, that they all had fridges at home, plumbing and indoor plumbing and so forth, that they went absolutely berserk because their standards of living were so poor already in the Soviet Union most of the time, and then the Germans on top of that invaded. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, it's certainly part of the story, but it's very important to convey the sheer scale of the Soviet losses in the Second World War. It's like
almost 30 million people. Right?
Yeah, it's so more people die in the siege of Leningrad than Britain and America between them losing the entire war. Just that 1 in 7 Soviet citizens dies, and so it's unsurprising there was kind of this pent up kind of rage, and it comes out in kind of like in sickeningly awful ways, especially as you mentioned in the sexual violence. And part of this is kind of like the seeing that what the Germans had in the first place, but also it's just that war is hell, and this helps to contextualize kind of like what happens. But the scale of the Soviet losses, are still kind of like very, very difficult to comprehend. And certainly you can't capture it even through the kind of numbers I've just given you.
All right. At the end, always an ungrateful question. Are there any historical parallels that we can draw from where we started at the beginning and where the West is right now, like with the Weimar Republic, with its welfare state and how quickly that turned, and, the West these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a long-standing account that explains the Weimar Republic's fall by the fact that Germans are not very good at democracy. They didn't have very much practice at it, and that the Weimar Republic is a kind of a doomed interlude between a monarchy and a dictatorship. But we don't have to look very far around the world today to see that even polities with hundreds of years of democratic history are kind of like swooning over kind of autocratic strongmen and tolerating the breakdown of the rule of law. Tolerating, the crumbling of the idea of universal rights. So very much, it's very, very, very contemporary. And then the war in the Ukraine, this is the worst European conflict since 1945. We're seeing the conduct of the Russian army is, sickening, violence against civilians, the use of camps, filtration camps. So unfortunately, all these echoes are kind of like a far too resonant today.
Professor Dillon, thank you so much for taking the time. What an interesting conversation. I hope we can do this again. Do you have any social media where people can follow what you're up to?
I'm on Bluesky. So
Bluesky, perfect. Letting go of Twitter.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
All do.
Very happy to let go of Twitter. Yes.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on, Zad. I really appreciate it.
Very much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you can. The tedious, cranky marketing tutorials instruct that I have to say this, so I'm saying it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's a tragic state of affairs, I know, but you can totally help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last, but certainly not least, like always, I have to thank my patrons. Tovariši and Tovarišice, without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal gratitude and many thanks to Peter Karba, Matija Zupančič, Dejan Žulnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juž Premrov, Nejc Sirk, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinjo, Goran, Gordan, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. The smart community is growing, so I'm deeply touched. Many, many thanks again.